Who's the chair?
Maybe I am.
Who is the chair? There's a chair. We have a real chair, so let's keep it like this here. We don't.
Yeah, no chairs.
We have a real chair. This is the first panel with a real chair. So this is the #1 innovation tonight. So we have a panel with a chair. So
For the sake of the recording, maybe we should say who's actually on the table.
Oh yeah.
we're recording.
Yeah. Is it okay with the two of you and Helga to tape record this?
How much do you pay?
I
Congratulations.
We're going to record it, we're going to play it tomorrow in the plenary session.
Very good. Actually, that's good.
During Stigler's talk.
So, what order is it going to be?
No, Stefano's Helga.
The order is Helga, Niklas, and me.
All right.
So Helga's represented by the empty chair.
That's it.
No, she has a more virtual presence in his presentation. The chair is the chair person. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're just basically continuing the conversation that we should have had after the previous session conversation.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do that. Okay.
But I think we should go, if that's okay, right? We should go through the presentation.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go through this presentation. So that's why I did want to tape it so that
As we see fit.
for the whole world.
Oh, very good. Yes, we'll webcast it someday.
That's fun site for all those who
Right.
tune in.
So give it the floor to Helga Wild.
Yes, actually, I will give it just a very short introduction. To all of us. So the presentation is a kind of collective effort in terms of it was conceived together. There are not 3 different panels, although they reflect, of course, to a large extent our own interests. What brought us together was the kind of experiences instantiated by Sponge work and your work. What we're trying to do is to look at them. Well, we've been in a few of them, I think, at least one of them in San Francisco. So, trying to reflect from a very philosophical point of view, even if our background, which I'll say just a couple of things later, is different. I think what pulls us together here is a philosophical look we have on these experiences and trying to reflect on what goes on in this environment that you guys are building, or rather, how can we understand what goes on? How, as philosophers, I should say, we can understand what goes on in this environment. The reason why we are interested in this kind of work is because, in a certain sense, it resonates very deeply with a very deep satisfaction which we all share, that is Niklas, Helga, and I share, which is dissatisfaction with what I will call, for short, the cognitivistic model of the world. It's not just cognitivistic, I mean, it's a much deeper root, as we all know, but for the sake of brevity. That is the model according to which our interaction with the world is conducted by an agent, which has a certain kind of mental representation, that model in AI terminology, artificial intelligence terminology, model of the world, which gets constantly updated through input, which comes from the world through some kind of sensor apparatus, and which the environment can be manipulated in terms of action effected by what artificial intelligence people call effectors, sensory order, manipulating organs of different kinds. This is kind of standard model that's been very predominant in the world of artificial intelligence and other disciplines, but of course finds its roots in the Western philosophical tradition, going at least as far as Descartes, but much farther back instead. So, what unites us here is this dissatisfaction with this model, and we think that the kind of work that we see in this immersive environment, so the kind of work in these installations, is animated by the same kind of satisfaction, although it's carried out in a different tone, and not at a philosophical level, but at a practical level in terms of installation. So, in a certain sense, we see your environment as a counterexample, as an example of an environment in which the cognitivistic model does not work, I mean, does not explain what goes on. And so we want to use it as an example and as an interesting test bed for alternative visions, of alternative models. A test bed, source of inspiration, and test bed for our own ideas. So it was. This can be summed up by saying that what we want to understand is what it means to be immersed in an environment, which of course, it's a big question. It is. What we want to understand is what it means to be in the world. And of course, if we have the answer to that question, we can pack on the whole, because all the problem will be solved. But anyway, we'll give it a shot. As I said, we are dissatisfied with cognitivist models, and we see the T guardians. I will mostly refer to the T guardians, at least because this is the work we know best. Although it was very interesting to hear what you decided to say about your current work, which goes in a very different direction from the guardian, and interestingly enough, it goes in the direction we would like to push our own understanding of this work. So as I said, we would like to use them, that is the T guardians, but also at this point, the other work, as both source of inspiration and test beds for our own models. We come from different backgrounds, as I said. Helga has a background in physiology and psychology and brain science. Niklas comes from mathematics and quantum mechanics and physics. I'm kind of the most straightforward guy here because I come from philosophy. I've only done philosophy in my life. Although my interests in philosophy are actually split between artificial intelligence and robotics, or philosophy and history of artificial intelligence and robotics, and contemporary European philosophy, especially post-World War II European, French, and Italian philosophy. So this kind of inspiration we bring to this panel. What are we going to talk about? So we want to approach this question: what are immersive environments? What does it mean to be immersed in this kind of environments? And we offer two approaches plus one. The first one, which Helga will virtually talk about, is the action perception loop model, which is a model that's been often been worked out over the last, 30, 40 years? It's at least that old. And we think has some interesting ideas to offer, but not enough to actually cover what goes on in this environment. And I will talk about the gameplay model and at the same time offering a critique of the gameplay model. That is, I will try to say that in fact, I think it covers more ground than the action perception loop model, but not all of it. There is something that escapes it, and what escapes the model is actually what we're most interested in, that is this idea of passivity, which we want to push for. And if I understand, if I name correctly what Niklas will be doing, and his presentation will be interleaved between Helga's and mine, we'll try to present something about what goes on behind immersive environments. That is not so much from the phenomenological point of view of the user, but from the point of view of the designer. What are our results? Well, we hope that our approaches illuminate some aspect of the immersive environments or the immersive interactions, but not all of them. This is something that still resists our own models, as I said. A different model, or rather a model, some cluster of concepts around the idea of passivity, we think are needed in order to go further, in order to capture something that is required and presupposed by the immersive environment, but it's not captured by either the action perception loop model or the play game model. Okay, so here we have now the first presentation, the action perception approach. Here is the slide we're talking about, and now this is Helga while talking. The first concept we want to bring to bear on the responsive environment called T-Garden and the others is the action perception loop. The notion is situated within psychology, but the intuition behind it existed long before psychology as a discipline, had been established. Remember that Descartes already differentiates between the sensory and the motor pathways in which we use on man, and describes their function, i.e. how to relate the body to the environment, in much the same way as a present-day physiologist might do, even if most of the physiological details are overhauled, because most of the physiological details that Descartes was talking about are overhauled nowadays, but the overall framework is very similar. Let us list the key ingredients of this approach, of the action perception loop approach, with the help of a diagram. So here's the diagram. You have an organism and an environment, and there are actually two loops, or two branches to this loop. There's a perception action loop and an action perception part of the loop. That is, from action we go to perception, and from perception we go to action, and this goes in circles on the right loop. So first, the approach distinguishes between organism and environment. The organism is in an environment, it is embedded in it. Notice right away that this is a very asocial approach right from the start. That is, any other organism is simply part of the environment. There is no privileged status between different organisms. Second, the organism's relation, or rather interaction, would be the appropriate term here, with the environment takes two forms, perception and action. Perception stands for the function of the sensory organs and the efferent pathways. That is, the nerve pathways that relate the state of the sensory organs to the higher center of the organism, as well as the outcome of this function. By implication, the input to the sensory organs comes from the environment. But perception is always in terms of the organism. One can perceive only what one has senses to register. This goes in the direction of impoverishing the world. Right? We can only get from the world what we are so equipped to register. Action, in the same way, means all parts of the organism that are responsible for carrying out an action as well as the result of their activation. In other words, it encompasses the efferent pathways, muscles, joints, the glands, etc., and the resulting impact on the organism's relation to the environment. Now the loop. So I talked about action, we have about perception first, about action, and now we're talking about the loop. So third, these functions are related to one another in a dynamic fashion. That is, what the term loop, or arc, as it has sometimes been called, refers to. Meaning, perception leads to action, and action leads to perception. However, take notice of the fact that the two sides of this cycle are not equivalent. The expression perception-action loop refers to the flow of sensory input to the higher centers and the subsequent flow of consequent efferent impulses, action of the organism, to the muscles and glands. It is a loop wholly internal to the organism connecting perception to action. The term action-perception loop, the flip side, however, is the connection between an action of the organism to a subsequent perception. The connection from action to perception is mediated by the environment. And one finds out about the environment by studying the specific form that this mediation takes. But that is getting ahead of myself. The connection from action to subsequent perception is going on outside of the organism's boundaries. Right? It's all here. This part of the loop is external to the organism, whereas the top side, from perception to action, is internal to the organism itself. Now, action-perception loop. So, talking about that part. Bottom. We'll then decide the questions associated with the perception-action loop and focus on the action-perception loop. As said before, this is the loop that takes in the environment. This is why we look at it to tell us something about environments, including responsive environments, such as the tea garden. It is in the nature of the action-perception loop that this taking in of the environment is necessarily an indirect one. The intervening environment expresses itself only in the connection, or lack thereof, between the action of the organism and the consequent perception of the same organism, assuming the organism does make such a connection. This is not always given. So how is an organ able to associate one of its actions with the consequent perception? According to the psychology at work here, the association between action and perception is formed on the basis of two major dimensions, probability and latency of the perception in relation to the preceding action. The more certain specific perception follow a specific action, the more likely the formation of an associated link between the two. The more reliably the perception follows the action instantaneously or within a short temporal window, the more likely an association is formed between the two, between the action and the perception. Let's call the combined effect of these dimensions simply the strength of the associated link. And let's look at the different forms that an action-perception loop can take based on the strength of the connection. So now what Helga does here is to go through different forms of action-perception loops in descending order of strength. The first case is the case of proprioception, in which case there is the strongest connection, strongest association. The strongest connection between action and perception is one which barely leaves the organism. It is called proprioception because all it does is relate how the action of the body has changed the organism's position in the environment. If, for instance, the preceding action is one of bending down, right, then the proprioceptor proprioceptors in the joints and muscle will sense the change in body posture, so that will be taken into account in the next action. The role of this action perception loop is to distinguish between real motion of the environment and apparent motion. That is, the organism has changed its position, which produces an apparent change in the environment. That is, if I bend down, of course, everything changes around me, right? I mean, I perceive the environment differently, but of course, because I have this action perception loop based on proprioceptors, I do not perceive the environment as changed, I only perceive my own posture as changed. This accounts, for example, for the stability of an image. We see it as one and the same, even though an intervening change in posture has changed every bit of the sense of impression. This is what artificial vision systems troubles adjusting to. Proprioception is interesting since it is responsible for forming what is called the body schema for the organism. But it applies to all environments equally and will not be very useful in explaining tea garden behavior. The only place where it might be relevant, and here we were thinking about that example of tea garden dancers. The only place where it might be relevant is when studying the impact that clothes have on the dancers. Adding weights and joints, restricting the sweep of a limb, all of this will lead to a shift in body schema, producing a different baseline against which further movements must be checked. It is not something that a dancer, or anyone else, will be conscious of. Ultimately, the impact of the clothes will be absorbed into the movements of the organism after a brief adjustment phase, and remain unnoticed for the rest of the performance. So it's not really going to impact how the dancer will interact with the environment, because it will be immediately internalized. What remains is possibly continued awareness of the constraints. So this was the first case, the strongest case, proprioception. Now we go to a different case, in which the association is not as strong, which Helga calls the reappearance case. The second case of action perception loop that we want to look at generates somewhat lower associative strength, but it does involve the environment in recognizable ways. It is called reappearance because it refers to the way in which an action can become almost instantaneously, again, a perception. For example, when you raise your hand, the hand may immediately appear in your field of vision. That means that you can use the eye to control the movement of the hand, trace its progress with respect to a given object, and fine-tune the action as needed. In engineering, one would call this a servo mechanism. A classical instance of this case is the eye-hand feedback loop. The first movement to reach out for an object is purely motor one without perceptual control, but as soon as the hand comes close to the object, the eye comes into play. Movement of the hand and the perception of the movement by the eye in relation to the object are tightly coupled in one closed loop. So in fact, I do not even perceive it as a loop. It's just one continuous flow. Movement of the hand and the perception of the movement by the eye in relation to the object are tightly coupled in one closed loop, executed again and again until the goal, that is the object, has been reached. For the time of the coupling, one has trouble perceiving the two parts as distinct, although physiologically we know that there are two parts, right? I mean, I'm continuously modulating the movement. The whole thing is experienced as one integrated motion towards a goal or toward a project, transcendent project. How does that help us in the present case, going back to the tea garden? Not clear that it does, over and beyond explaining the normal coordination that dancers employ to move in graceful ways. It is not clear that the tea garden environment calls for anything beyond that, since it deliberately abstains from supplying any goal or purpose to the actors. Now here the point is that in the tea garden, precisely because it's based on the idea of free improvisation and free play, there are no transcendent goals, as we call them, and therefore this kind of tightly closed loops do not come into play. So case 3, association of action to environmental response. The most interesting case for our purpose is when the association is tentative, a link that could be made but need not. Association that can be formed and unformed based upon the characteristics of the factors mentioned above, that is probability and latency, and possibly others. When the organism finds out that specific action produce predictable consequences, it forms an association between these, that is, it learns. Organisms are especially good at picking up those aspects of the environment that are predictable consequences of some specific action. There are limits to how far in the future the response can be and still allow for the association. This is where latency becomes absolutely crucial here, the latency of the environment response to the action. In general, it seems that the probability is most important. It must be so close to certainty as to be indistinguishable from it. All other probabilities, even fairly high probabilities, we tend not to exploit in our everyday dealings with the environment, philosophical gambling and lottery notwithstanding. we would not want to have our appliances, for instance, operate on statistical principle. We select those aspects of the environment that reliably produce the same response to the same action. We create our artificial environments to be of the same kind. So, when we flip the light switch, for example, we expect the light to come on with the probability of 1, not 0.99, right? Or 9999. No, it's got to be 1. And it's always 1. I mean, if light does not come on,
It's broken.
that means there's something wrong. It's not that we accept that event as due to the statistical probability. It's not statistical, it's just a symptom of a different problem. So never mind about the electrical grid that goes on, the power plant, light bulb, and so on. No, we are not perceiving any of it. All that we need and must have is the immediate and reliable response to our action to make all that intervenes to bring it about disappear from view. The effect of this is that we rely on parts of the environment for their consequences without focusing on them or even perceiving them. We learn to use them, or what it is we are using becomes transparent in the mediation of some transcendent goal. This the idea of transcendence here plays quite a key role in our own thinking, and this, I hope, will become apparent later on. One name for all this is tool, or ready to hand, to use the Helga terminology. And yes, the tool remains unobjectified while it works in that way. It's never not. You can just pick it up on Helga's analysis. When the response does not or no longer come with certainty, we diagnose a breakdown in the tool. We do not usually take this as an unexpected deviation from certainty. That's what I was saying before. Okay, so this is kind of the general presentation of the action perception loop. Now we go in the last part into the TIGAR. Putting together the lessons learned from this discussion into psychology, we can say the following. The action perception loop gives us some insight into the way in which the TIGAR environment influences the behavior of its participants. We need to distinguish between adaptation to the material aspect of the clothes via proprioception on the one hand, and on the other hand, learning the environmental, that is, how it accounts for the occurrence of a learning phase, but fails to render the environment transparent. We think that this is actually perhaps the most puzzling part of those immersive environments from the point of view of the participant in the environment. There is some kind of response, but the response is not transparent. The participant, speaking from experience here, since I was one of them, cannot turn the environment into a tool, right? Therefore, with all the features we talked about before. So, this model tells us on a very basic level how the clothes affect the movement of the dancers by affecting the proprioceptive schema for the body. So there is a kind of adjustment going on which takes place as soon as the clothes are done, even before the dancers enter the environment. And we've seen this in the video earlier on today. This approach also tells us something about the initial phase in each of the dancers' participation in the environment. That is, when they try to elicit responses from the environment through various moves and gestures in order to establish reliable associations. They attempt to learn the characteristics of the environment. While adjustment is easy and quick, we saw how dancers, for example, explored movements made possible or restrained by the costume. The same is not true for forming association between actions and the responses from the environment. Dancers cannot easily learn the sensory aspect of the clothes, how these materials and their informational links in with the environmental responses. We hope this is the case. Nor are dancers able to establish connections between their, say, position in space or their position with respect to another actor and the response of the environment. Let's quickly insert here that the action perception loop makes no provision for another organism in its scheme, as I was saying before. It's basically a social model. But even if it did, it is unlikely that the actors would be able to learn to exploit that. So we can say that the action perception loop does account for the occurrence of a learning phase, but the learning fails, precisely because of the lack of transparency. We can see that the dancers soon give up the learning attempt and resolve to treat the environment as independent. This is something that Shinwei was talking about actually in the morning in the tokenistic session. And I think that was very important when we were discussing about this issue, because they immediately decided to push the responses of the environment in the background and treat as noise. That was knowledge means that there is no learning possible. That means that T-Garden accomplishes one of its professed goals, namely to provide a rich and complex environment. It refuses to let itself be used simply as a tool. And so, finally, to sum up, the action perception loop accounts for some of the adaptation of the actors to the environment and for the occurring of the learning phase, but falls short in other respects. It makes a rigid separation between organism and environment, which makes it impossible for the organism to receive anything but itself indirectly reflected back from the environment. It does not allow for the existence of other organisms in the environment. It would do well in describing tool use in the context of some project or purpose, but this is precisely what the responsive environment is being designed to escape from. Thus, it falls short of capturing the creator's intention and needs to be abandoned in favor of another approach, which is what we will be doing next.
Yay, Helga.
So, these I'd like them up with. I don't know whether they still reflect what
No, it does.
talking about. At a certain point, it did reflect.
No, it still does.
But I still like I'm listed here as playing, you know, which is very good. So I can make some nasty remarks for the record. For the record, you know, like Inspector Clouseau, which is my name for that tool, you know, was very interesting. What he didn't have to say today at Shinbei's and Chris's presentation.
And Joel.
But I have to say that I'm very impressed with the people that we're competing with. You know, there are people who are discussing, apropos Helga's theme, brains as magical objects. I'm very happy to know that must have been very interesting. Then there is another one on, well, I will
Say it. It's on tape, go ahead.
Varela, isn't it? It's like Varela's.
Well, yes, well, the Varela, which is very lovely when it says,
Varela and Deleuze.
well, yes, that could be interesting. But it's alternative ontologies of biological systems in Margaret Cavendish's 17th century. And Francisco Varela's cognitive network theory of immunology. I mean, this is an amazing, I have to say, I'm very happy with people. Then there's another one here, Goethe's Homunculus, and there we go, and Shelley's Monster, on the romantic prototypes of modern biotechnology. And then, of course,
You're getting this for the record, too, right?
this is for the record, so because, you know,
Why do you think I'm sitting behind
yes.
the camera?
Yeah. But, yeah.
Clever move.
But I'm very glad that Inspector Clouseau was around for the presentation. Because I don't think Inspector Clouseau would find what I have to say interesting. So, here we go. What I find fascinating about Shinbei's work, I found all along, but today was kind of confirmed to me directly by seeing Joel's take, which I only had heard of from Shinbei, but now I've heard it from the horse's mouth, and I like the brain. So, to make it. The interesting idea is that I wanted to find a way to give a feeling for people who have no feeling for mathematics or physics, what it is that Shinbei is doing that is very special. And that's part of his madness and part of the difficulty and part of why his whole experiment, you know, even if it fails, we can learn a lot from it. And it has to do with the way Shinbei and now Joel in his own way are using mathematical formulas to show that in some sense the mathematics of the formula has its own materiality, if you like. And this is not used metaphorically. I mean, the whole idea is that the notion of materiality is up for grabs. But at the same time, the mathematical formula has an uncanny ability to describe something that before you sort of only experience crudely as being two different media. In other words, I can write an equation of motion in water, and at the same time now in the environment of Shinbei, I can experience the flow. So in some sense, the mathematical structure reconstructs, you know, a little bit of the experience of a flow by using an equation like a Navier-Stokes equation, you know, of flow. So, but I think that the major intuition of both Shinbei and Joel's background comes from, you know, field theory, which I know something about, and, you know, this whole idea of what is an ontology of particles and fields. Now, field theory, is, if I were to present it again, part of the challenge here, and I'm very grateful to Shinvei for this because I think a lot of his work, I think, is pedagogically can be very instructive to others who don't know mathematics, but could be guided. And here, this is also a request on my part for Shinvei in the future, that we can find some way to make a bit more available. I don't know how, this is kind of a wishful thought on my part, of how to make some of the mathematics that you're using and the topology, not a la Plotnitsky, why that on a meta level is blah, 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 but why this is pedagogically the way to show people into, to make people get into, yes, what you're doing. So in that sense, for me, that's a tall order, and it's not really, but I think it's an interesting way of making mathematics more relevant for people who don't need to know mathematics, but they can at the same time begin to problematize some of the issues of using mathematics in this new context. I think that's important also because one of the things that I find, regrettable, here, and it really pisses me off, is that these are important issues which I think have to be discussed. And I think Shinvei and Joel and Chris are trying to create a new environment to discuss philosophical questions. And they become something else. I also don't want, because I have my dear friend Patrice and Stefano here, who are professional philosophers, who have sensitivities to what the philosophical problem is. So I don't want here to presume, to speak about Deleuze, that I want to posit a problem in order to solve it. I want to say that in some sense, the challenge of the philosopher in the Deleuzean vein is to create problems. In other words, the problem space is more interesting than the solutions. But it would be interesting to show to people who are not mathematicians, well, does it mean to have a problem space instead of something like this, So, part of the, so now, I also want to preface what I'm about to read you a bit with a caveat. I am not experienced as a teacher of physics. In other words, I don't have my own good pedagogical experience. So there might be right now some people out there, I'm sure there are, who are expert, very good, teachers of field theory for engineering students. But I don't think I don't want to suggest that what I'm about to read you is a field theory for poets. and I don't think this is the way it should go. But I know there are a lot of people out there who want to make an effort to make field theory become a language or something, or a non-language language, that is relevant to other people. So I don't want to just enrich the vocabulary of some humanists who right now, they talk about complexity, they talk about chaos, and why the hell, they can also talk about fields, So we give them a third word to talk at the cocktail party. I don't want to give them, they already have too many words. So how do I reduce their words, but somehow make some music come out of it? For me, I was really thinking when you were describing the challenge that musicians have, and in a sense you want to reintroduce in the interface with the instrument, with the computer becoming a special instrument. I would like to think that language now, and in a sense language in a linguistic sense, can become also an instrument where people can feel resistance and work harder at it. Well, I think these people here are really transparent. They're not working very hard with words. And I think right now I would like to find another way in which one can work with words that is harder, And that's also this is sort of a riffing off from the point of Joel's, that part of the energy that a performer gives comes from the effort. So if there's no effort, there's no bloody energy. And if there's no bloody energy, there's no feeling, there's nothing, in a sense, So the challenge is to come up, I wanted to match a little bit the pairings of my co-panelists. Stefano will talk a little bit about play, game, and that's an interesting pair. It's not exactly an opposition, but there are differences. And then, of course, Helga had the action perception, things that, again, you can see them as different faculties, or you can see them right now as forming one whole. And in a similar way, I think field and particle are co-definable, okay? So the idea here is that in order to make field theory interesting to a non-physicist, but to also someone who can appreciate how someone like Shinbei, who's also not a physicist but understands enough of the mathematics, or Joel, can make it relevant, is to show how a physicist takes hold of the world. Because in a certain way, that's precisely what you and Shinbei are trying to do. You try to use the computer to take a different hold of the world. And therefore, to go back to Stefano at the introduction saying, understand a little bit better how thereby we're immersed in the world. Because getting hold of the world is just not a way of controlling it, but a certain way of understanding how it responds to you and how you're part of it. So the question then becomes, what particles must be like? Well, one of the things that I can really say, that brings us back a little bit in the morning discussion about phenomenology, you can say that if particles are to act like particles supposed to, then they are a bit like the proverbial billiard balls. So this initial phenomenological experience of the particle as a billiard ball, is not a bad one, okay? And now, so a physicist in a funny way sort of starts with that. So he then takes a step further, in a sense, to speak Bergsonian again. This is not an abstraction. This is now getting a little bit more specific about this billiard balliness of the billiard ball, and say, what is it special about this damn billiard ball? Well, it has to be localized and separated. Okay? It has to be stable, and it has to be distinctively named. And here, this is important because the naming of is very important, because it's a kind of a sleight of hand for the physicist, that he has to give the billiard ball a label, which he does not, in a sense, have a theoretical justification for, but it plays a very important role in his differentiating function. So, in other words, at that point, once he has labeled it, he renders it atomic, meaning that he cannot individuate it no longer. So, in a sense, at that point, that unit is supposed to be closed, and therefore it can then be added. It becomes something that can be connected with something else, but its own individuality is declared, closured by the physicist. So let me elaborate. What does it mean for particles to be localized? It means that they have a position and a characteristic size or enclosing radius. And then it is possible to speak, so to speak, of they are penetrating their surfaces and getting inside them, if they're not point-like. So this is the interesting thing, that right now the physicist goes from this billiard ball thing to the sort of the mathematician's notion of a point that is supposed to behave like a particle, like a billiard ball without being one. Okay? So in a certain sense, there is something billiard ball-y about a point-like mass, without now having to assume any of the traditional material things to fill in that. In other words, there's already something there to work with. But localization is not only in an ordinary geometric ambient space, as Plotnitsky was saying. By artifice and by decree, it may be achieved in other ways as well. Take this example. In accounting for superconductivity, which is observing some quantum mechanical effects on a macroscopic scale, the right particles are composed of two electrons acting in concert, forming a lattice, what is called, the Cooper pairs. So we developed a formalism that allows us to treat the two electrons as a single object suitably located in a peculiar space. Physicists now are convinced that they must always be looking at almost anything so that it can be localized somewhere. So in a sense, they have to do this Bergsonian reduction in order for this point-like particle to exist for them. Now, each localized object, as I said, must also be separated from other such objects. There must be the possibility of a space between them. The trick is to find a space, and this is sort of where I'm getting a little bit to what Shinbei behind the scenes is trying to do, which may not be the one of ordinary extension, in which the particles that we have defined as distinct are in fact separated and localized in that space. So in some sense, you need now the mathematician's space in order for these particles, to find a home. Okay? So a little parenthesis here is that when an ordinary person tries to imagine how a billiard ball exists in this ambient space, he has not seen, he does not do what the physicist or mathematician does, who creates an environment, if you like, for that point to be there. in other words, the interesting thing about the topological space is that it is not a coordinate space, okay? So that means that the place in which you're going to find the particle and the particle have to be conjoined, as it were, in order for this particle to have a place in a mathematical space. So when physicists introduce now such things, what they call quantum numbers, which is a very fancy way of saying labeling things in order to distinguish them, they're identifying in the process an enlarged space in which different particles are now differently labeled and therefore differently separated. So whereas with the ordinary particle you can move it, and you can use, so to speak, something like the actual perception loop of Helga to see to what extent your project with that particle can tell you if it has moved from here to there. The physicist doesn't have an actual perception loop to work with at that point. Instead, he uses his mathematical space as the tool or the framework.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Are you thinking of particles as being labeled by their predicates, or not?
No, in the case of strangers or something like this, they're labeled by their predicates. Correct? Yes.
Okay.
But I know that in your case you don't want to do that. I mean, but at least I know that in the physics context, yes, they're labeled by their predicates. Now, the next thing that's interesting about a particle is that it's stable if no matter how you look at it, is again the same, having a so-called invariant set of properties. Of course, the problem right now is to invent and justify a range of such no matter how you look at it, something becomes invariant. Some ways of looking, like crashing or exploding, will almost certainly change what we see. So we need to say in which ways are out of bounds, or we need to give an account how what we see is affected by our mode of probing. So if the back of an at first seemingly round object looks different, this than does the front, like considering a half a tomato, we might want to say that the angle of approach affects what we see. And this is just how, okay? So when you have a tomato, that in order to find out whether it's a really round tomato, you have to walk around, and that's the way in which you find out. So differences in what we encounter are taken account of, and so we might say that we're seeing the same object. As I shall show briefly below, one of the functions of fields is to give such an account of how the path to the particle determines what you're going to see. Okay? This is... So next comes what I call the predicating or the naming, which matters. A particle may well need a fairly complex name if we're to account for its appearances and capacities under the various modes of looking at it or taking hold of it. It has more than one or two relevant features or predicates. That is, it displays a goodly greater number of so-called degrees of freedom or handles. Only with such a complex name will it be all possible to distinguish it or to separate it from its other cousins. Otherwise, it would be the same, at least in name, as they are. Yet, as cousins will act differently in certain circumstances. You see, the interesting thing to remember here, this is one of the more philosophical points, unlike billiard balls, which in some sense, they do have a way of holding their own ground, and you can always find, so to speak, or project, or if you like, something into, so you can say, like, these two things here are not the same. The particles that the physicist starts with, even though, as I said at the beginning, he takes an approach to them as if they were billiard balls. The one thing that you have to remember, this is a very important point, is that all particles on the microscopic level are indistinguishable from each other. Okay, so that is a very peculiar thing. For all I know, there might be really one particle, as my old advisor would say, that goes really fast.
That's why I was asking if they're labeled. You consider names as predicates as names. Otherwise,
yeah, I know.
How else
and as my brilliant wife said, now you are cheating, she says, because if you begin, to assume that you cannot distinguish the particles other than through the predicates, then what's happening? Okay, I mean, at that point, I'm sneaking in the description, and that's not good, because in one sense, the indistinguishability of particles is supposed to be something of their materiality or whatever, of their essence, not a trick that you are resolving or making up by labeling them in different ways. So obviously the labeling is not an innocent act. but it's also not the thing that creates the particles. So even though the particles in the microscopic level are indistinguishable, they still have a way by which you can approach them. So, if such differing cousins are not well distinguished, I say, there won't be stability. So elementary particles not only are known by their masses and charges, but also by their so-called angular momenta, isotopic spins, flavors, charms, and other things. All these are properties that are needed to describe what each of them do. One of the fantasies now of the theoretical physicist is to need only one name, say the mass, from which to be able to deduce all the properties of the others. So in that sense, the physicist tries to overcome the proliferation of too many predicates on the linguistic level by trying to claim that there is, so to speak, ontologically one big property, mass, you know? Exactly. And out of that, you know, and tricky guys. Actually, it turns out that to be the same kind of particle may in different environments or practices be called light, or gamma ray, or photon particles. So I'm giving you right now a little bit just information about which is really just terminology. You know, we're just, it's like discussing, I don't know, saying ready to hand, and what would be the German of this? Vorhanden, and so on. So, but you are saying the same thing, but in one sense you're using the German word, and the other one you're using the English. So in this sense, you know, you can say that in each actual case, so as I said, the same kind of particle may be in different environments be called light, or a gamma ray, or a photon particle. And in each actual case, they act differently toward it. And this is not a matter of degeneracy, but rather different practices performed by different disciplines of physics. So a particle of electromagnetic radiation, when grouped with radioactivities, is called a gamma ray, going along with alpha and beta rays. But when grouped with vector bosons, particles that is with angular momentum or spin of 1, that is going along with the W plus and minus and the zoo, then there is called a photon, and is symbolized, you know, by a Greek letter with a small, a Greek K and lowercase Greek letter. The natural associations of each naming scheme are different whether it be radioactivity or radiation, atomic interactions, individual particle detection. In sum, a name as a set of properties that uniquely define an object depends on the work the object does, the kinds of insults it is subjected to, and then the kind of just particles like it, who happen to be in the neighborhood, that are right now are brought in for good measure, you know, to help you perform different ways of associating them. Which brings me to the issue of how do you do that when you're a physicist as opposed to just a topologist, meaning as opposed to someone who wants to take the intuition of connectivity as primary. The physicist right now has separated his particles, so he right now has to give them additivity. In other words, he has to find a certain way of linking them again. I mean, addition is a very peculiar operation to begin with, you know, and it's unclear in what space are you really adding things. So there's this range of circumstances that when we put similar particles together, we expect that some properties of the collection, called its extensive properties, which will be the arithmetic sum of the component particles properties, so it's electric charge, or the mass, or the weight, or the energy, or the entropy. These are the additive properties of it. So the extensive properties come to reflect our intuition that now, on the macroscopic level, a billiard ball has weight and a volume, and again that a collection of billiard balls have their total weight and volume. This is important because, as you know, Deleuze makes this whole spiel about intensive versus extensive qualities. And the idea here is, you know, that something like temperature is interesting because it's an intensive property. That meaning when you divide a tank of water, okay, and you put it apart, you're not finding out, you know, that the one thing will be hotter, the part that you cut to the left from the one to the right. So in some sense, there's, you know, the temperature stays constant. But what I mean by that, the experience of the division, you know, has not affected the property, you know, that is at stake. So enough about so the particle side of what the physicist means, or what work does he do with particles, and what work particles do for him. But the part of now that needs to close the picture has to be the issue of a field, okay, which is, so to speak, the environment in which the particles that I gave you a sketch of are part of. So what is a field? Here again, the initial phenomenological intuition is an interesting way how, again, good old Bergson, you know, was right to say take experience, the richness of experience, and try to find ways to honor it and respect it rather than abstract from it. So the conventional picture is of a fluid which recalls, the flowing of a river, or an ocean. At every point in space, the water has a velocity, and those local features link up into larger scale lines of flow. The values of the field, here the velocities, at nearby points are in general not arbitrarily different from each other, for otherwise there would be no flow, and therefore no continuity. Also, we know that the fluid is conserved. What flows into a volume must eventually flow out, unless there's of course a sink at that point. Fields, in a sense, are antithetical to particles. Being spread out in space, they are not localized. But they do have a well-defined value, nevertheless, at each point, such as the velocity of the flow. Hence, fields have an infinitude of degrees of freedom, since those values might be arbitrarily different at each point. Shinbei is exploiting this enormously when he's programming. But if there is continuity in conservation, the arbitrariness is severely restricted. Insofar as fields are explicitly designed so that they work along with particles, that design even further restricts and so tames their degrees of freedom and therefore their arbitrariness. If particles are like billiard boards, as I said, then fields are more like fluids in motion. But in what sense are fields like those fluids? As I've indicated, the features that physicists abstract from such a fluid flow can become definitive of a field if you concentrate on the following, on what they call smoothness. Smoothness is basically the connections to particles which are its sources and rules of accounting for the sources and flows. So where space was once sort of thought Kantian, in the Kantian sense, the possibility of separation, now it becomes a fabric-like, weaving everything into a connected whole. So in a certain sense, a Kantian experience of space cannot describe either mathematically or phenomenologically the space in which your work and Shinbei's operates, both mathematically, but even right now as an immersive environment. In other words, right now, Kant, if he was really consistent, he could not use his own a priori intuition of space to describe what's happening in that environment. In other words, a field is not only continuous, the value at each point depending on nearby values of the field itself, but the field tends to be reasonably smooth. The fluid's velocity changes slowly in space and time, except at well-defined places. If we know both the rules of spatial dependence or interconnection and the value of the field at the boundaries at a particular time, we might even be able to use those rules to figure out the field values everywhere, working our way in, away from the boundary, and from that particular time forward, so to speak. So a field then becomes something that is connected to particles which act as its sources, much as the fluid flowing in a river is connected to its springs and mountain sources. So in a certain sense, the particle is not just what the river is made of. The particle is the thing that allows something like a river to have a flow. That's an interesting and I think a deep point to work with. And I think Shinbei's and Joel's work is playing with that a lot. I mean, is capitalizing on that. Next, I don't know if the next is really sort of here relevant because I think I go a bit on describing how a physicist does a bit of the accounting of his particles the way an accountant does. But I don't want to digress into the economic metaphor. I think right now I think there's a lot of the things that I brought up. I did it in order to just sort of show that a lot of what inspires Shinbei's intuitions when he programs his environments are very much informed. At least this is my reading of him, and he doesn't controvert it, are informed by these kind of ideas that a physicist who writes equations for physical systems does. So the nice point here, as I said, to reiterate at the beginning, is that the materiality that people talk, in some sense, lies in the equation. But that equation is no longer somewhere in some abstract heaven. But in some sense, the structure of the equation is part of the world in which this new experience can be had. And I think that's for me where the real possibilities, to do something interesting with mathematical tools, which can become available. I mean, now, non-mathematicians can become, with the help of people like Shinbei, Joel, myself, can be trained, or trained is a bad word, can be sort of introduced, you know, and become playful, and I like here to speak fancily of something which is exactly, I feel right now, I would not want to say it in the presence of the SLS great minds. It has to do with the fact that I believe, for me, the interesting thing about mathematics is that it can become the poetry of the 21st century. And what I mean by that is that poetry in the past, you know, not everybody can be a poet. I mean, it means how I can imagine because they can say words, but we all know, right, that a poem can do amazing things with language, and then people can learn to respond to the poetry. So in one sense, people learn after a while to hear poetry. So even though not everybody is a poet, there is a culture, you know, that can cultivate an audience for poetry, a sensibility for poetry. And I believe right now people can become slowly more sensible, you know, sensitized to mathematics that way. So that does it. Thank you.
There's an interesting parallel to this particle field dichotomy that's come up within TCAR, which is this issue of the continuous models, which we're all interested in, which Shimura and Jan were developing, and the problem that these continuous models, kind of like space continuous models, have to be loaded somehow with particularity, particular kinds of sound, particular sensor responses, particular gestures that people are going to be
Tune.
so it's kind of a tuning issue. It's like scales or something like that. Until you know some of the particles, in a sense, you can't fully articulate the continuous system. So you're always like fighting back and forth.
Very nice. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because there's this some transition state between this kind of abstraction of mathematics